Maybe you could kind of kick us off by helping us understand, again, you've been working on these issues for a while, and you've been working in a bipartisan way at the local and state level in Ohio. But, how has this unfortunate incident maybe focused these efforts and maybe even provided an opportunity for progress, if there is any?
Right. Well, it's a pleasure to be here today, and Warwick, thanks for inviting me. I think most people know that, Dayton, unfortunately, isn't even the latest mass shooting that's occurred now. That's Midland and Odessa. But on August 4th, we had a 24-year-old gunman come to an area of our community that is trendy, fun, diverse, the place to hang out, and in the course of 29 seconds, killed 9 people and wounded 40 more. And for me, personally, as mayor, just to give context, the first group I joined when I became mayor of the city of Dayton nationally was the U.S. Conference of Mayors. I've always loved mayors. I think they get stuff done. I'm biased about the position. But the second group I joined was Mayors Against Illegal Guns. And so I've always been active in the space around getting common sense gun legislation through, have always been an advocate for it, and really knew and said to other mayors, for example, when Cincinnati had their mass shooting, Cincinnati's about an hour away from Dayton, there by the grace of God, we go. And we always feel that way, I think, as mayors in these communities, that, it can happen to your city at any time. You don't know when it's going to happen. And unfortunately now it's likely going to happen. And so that evening, the night before, I was actually with my husband and had seen that Dee Margo, the mayor of El Paso, had a mass shooting, and said, I said to my husband, this is so bad. I feel so terrible for Dee. I'll give him a call tomorrow. And then I was woken in the middle of the night to what happened in Dayton. What has happened since El Paso, Dayton, has been interesting and, quite frankly, surprising to even me, because the work of, unfortunately, the work of this effort to get some common sense gun legislation through, it keeps on just piling on top of each other in these kind of flash moments. And for Dayton, we were the 250th site for a mass shooting just this year. I think we're at 291, 292 today. And it's interesting what galvanizes the country and which ones make the flashpoint. But unfortunately, because of that, and because of just the continual, it's becoming almost ubiquitous, right? Everyone knows someone or knows some community or has some connection to some community that's had this. That it is getting to this tipping point of action, and I think that's what we're really seeing right now in the conversation.
Thank you for sharing that. Doug, now you've worked for a long time on criminal justice issues, and you've actually brought the arts into some of that. Could you talk about some of that work and, again, the progress that you were able to make and how that may help us sort of see pathways forward on these issues?
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. It's an honor to be on the same panel as Mayor Whaley. And I would like to also want to reinforce some of those numbers you heard earlier from Erica. And I want to just kind of review that with you. So 2.2 million people are incarcerated in America. 70 million people in the country have a criminal record. 6.7 million people are under some form of correctional control, which includes probation as well as parole. 2.8 million children have parents that are incarcerated. And 500,000 people come out every year, with 2/3 of them returning. So that's the context that we're in terms of criminal justice. And the work that we've been doing over the last several years has been to really think about what are the best practices that exist across what I call the criminal justice continuum, which has been rather bipartisan, in the sense that this is one of the few things that in this country where there's been some bipartisan agreement is really on criminal justice reform and criminal justice transformation. So if we think about that continuum, we think about it in terms of the front end, middle, and back end. The front end meaning preventing people from going into the criminal justice system to begin with. So there's been a lot of bipartisan work. when it comes to exclusionary policies, when it comes to discipline, so reducing the school to confinement pipeline, alternatives to incarceration and diversion. There's been a lot of work on sentencing reform, most recently the First Step Act, which was passed by the Congress and signed by the President. And then there's been a lot of work on bail reform, policing, and then finally prosecutorial reform. I'm so glad this came up in the last panel because 80% of DAs run unopposed. And there are examples out there where there have been both bipartisan examples of progressive prosecutors. Melissa Nelson was elected in the Fourth Circuit in Florida, Republican. And Larry Krasner, which was mentioned earlier, was elected in Philadelphia. And so there's been a lot of different examples of that happening across the country, but more needs to happen. If 80% run unopposed, that means there needs to be a little bit more motivation and participation among voters. In the middle part, we focus a lot on college and prison and access to free expression, and there's been a lot of work done on that. That's bipartisan. One of the great examples I have is when we launched, when I was at the Ford Foundation, the Renewing Communities Initiative in California, which launched college and prison. We started in one prison in San Quentin. Now we're in all 35 prisons. That was the same day that Kamala Harris was the keynote speaker. She was Attorney General of California. She was speaking on the same day that Chris Christie was governor of New Jersey with our Pathways Project, which is also college and prison. If you look at what both of them said, you'll note that they both basically said the same thing in terms of the importance of it. And then finally, there's been a lot of work on supporting people when they get out of prison in terms of access to employment, continuing education, access to mental health and substance abuse. And we could see that beginning back in 2007 when President Bush signed the Second Chance Act. So there's been a lot of examples where there's been bipartisan work, and there's a lot of things we still need to do to move forward.
Excellent. Well, again, today we also heard a lot from activists who are working at the grassroots level, whether it's Sandy Hook Promise, whether it's March for Our Lives. And Mayor Whaley, you mentioned in your intro that you like being a mayor because you like getting things done. So I thought maybe in addition to talking about the bipartisan nature of the way forward, maybe the dichotomy also between working at the local level and working at the national level, because we've certainly seen a lot of paralysis in Congress in Washington, but mayors like you are working with, for instance, your governor to get things done at the local level. Is that where you see opportunity on these issues?
Well, I think like most of the folks that are advocating, it's just pushing wherever you can, right? And so the day of the next day of the shooting as mayor, frankly, you talk to a lot of mayors about their shootings, and so there's things that you learn. And the two things that I wanted to get done during that day, I wanted to communicate a lot with the community so they knew what was happening, and really be there for the community. You have to be the leader that helps your community grieve and kind of give them the permission to do that. And then I wanted to have a victims fund for the folks that had lost loved ones or who were injured. And then I wanted to have a vigil that night. And I wanted to do it in the district because it was very important, I think, to claim this space back. Because it's a lot of small businesses. They all, really run on a shoestring. And, we had to claim this space really quickly. And that evening, we were able to do that. The business district supported that. And that evening, the governor, the other thing I did was I took the governor and his wife and both senators and the local congressman to the site. And honestly, I didn't think much about that. I figured that's why they were coming to Dayton. That's what they'd need to see. And the governor later said that was and he was the former attorney general and former county prosecutor, former lieutenant governor. He later said it was the largest crime scene he'd ever been on. And I think people have different flashpoints of what moves people in these conversations. And it also happened to be the 26th anniversary of his daughter's death of a car accident was the day of the Dayton shooting. So it seemed to take away some of the politics off of this issue. And the governor has been really good through this process, trying to move to get something done too. But the evening of the vigil, he and his wife came to the event. And there were a couple thousand people there, and just organically through the crowd, people were grieving, they were scared, and they were angry. And from the crowd came this chant of "do something." And the governor couldn't speak anymore because he was overcome with the sound off of the crowd. And I was actually a little worried about it. We're in different parties, and I know the governor a little bit, even though we're from the same area. It wasn't like, it's even partisan in states like Ohio, of course, where Republicans hang out with Republicans and Democrats hang out with Democrats. At the end of the vigil, I said to the governor, I'm really sorry, people are just really hurting and they're really wound up. And he said, Nan, that is part of the job. And 2 days later, he came to me and called and said, a day and a half later, he called and said, hey, I'm gonna put out these 17 points of what I want to try to do. And one of them is background checks. And one is an extreme risk protection. Those are the two there's other pieces in it, but those are the two places that I think are the most, has most potential in Ohio. Keep in mind just the state of Ohio 2 years ago. We lost an effort to keep guns out of daycare centers. Also in this biennium of this legislature is a proposal to get rid of the permit for concealed carry, that you could just concealed carry wherever you want. So this is a huge C-turn that this governor is attempting to do. And I feel compelled to support that. Like, I would go further than the governor, but if we're going to try to get movement, I think it has to be done, particularly in Ohio, in a bipartisan manner. So that's kind of the work that we're seeing in the state. That doesn't make us stop the work we're trying to do nationally. We were there last week in Washington, D.C. It's very difficult and very sad, frankly, in Washington, D.C. I mean, you just feel just so much inaction, and you feel the partisanness that you don't feel in your community. And I think that's unfortunate and unnecessary, and people need to be held account to that, not only on this issue, but in issues across the board. But we'll still keep on pushing, because you never know, right? So you just keep on keeping on.
Well, thank you for that. And Doug, I know you have a particular perspective on that dichotomy as well, just based on some of the work you've done. You've worked on sort of the concentration of the prison population in different communities, and I wonder if you could kind of speak to those issues as well.
I'm so glad the mayor mentioned the importance of communities. And that's where a lot of the solutions have got to come from, and also be able to inform what happens at the state and federal level. So let me give you an example about this. If you looked at the report that came out from the National Research Council back in 1994 on mass incarceration, it used New York State as an example. So 2/3 of the people who come out of prison in New York State go back to New York City, and they go to 5 communities. So half the prison population in the state of New York end up in 5 communities. We know exactly where those communities are. It's Central Harlem, East Harlem, South Bronx, East New York, and parts of Bed-Stuy. If you go to Chicago and go to the state of Illinois, 2/3 of the people in the state of Illinois go back to communities in Chicago. Chicago has 77 community areas, 216 neighborhoods. They go to 7 of them. So, we can actually think about what needs to happen in these places where there are spatial concentrations of high rates of incarceration, because that's where lots of the issues around mass incarceration are happening. And it does have a huge impact, not only in terms of economic insecurity, but also when it comes to educational attainment, violence, and particularly on women's health. So I think this is something that we need to be very thoughtful about in terms of not only the best practices across the continuum, but then how you actually anchor it in that holistic approach at the neighborhood community level. So.
That's great. And I'd like to stay with you, Doug, too, just to sort of build on that in terms of, again, where we see avenues and opportunities for progress. And so, you've done some work on, the Second Chance Pell Grants. You've done some work as far as the recent reauthorization of the Juvenile Justice Act. Could you kind of talk about maybe the lessons learned and, again, the opportunity to either, scale some of these solutions or apply them more broadly on the issues that we've been talking about today?
Well, I do think it's important to build upon some of the successes that we've already had. The Second Chance Pell was an important movement in terms of thinking about addressing what happened in the 1994 crime bill. That was also bipartisan, but bipartisan in a negative way, in the sense that we put $60 billion into building prisons. We quadrupled the number of people in prison from 1994 up to this time. But over time, we've now recognized it's important to address particular issues that help us to think about reducing mass incarceration in a very bipartisan manner. So, for example, when it came to the Second Chance Pell, we were able to engage the current Secretary of Education. She actually went to Goucher College and observed high-quality post-secondary courses. And then a friend of mine, Senator Alexander, because of my time in Tennessee, who's chair of the HELP Committee, who's retiring next year. They both actually said something in the New York Times, an editorial page, about the potentiality and the importance of access to college and prison for people who are there. So I think there are these places where there are opportunities to expand upon that. And the Juvenile Justice Act, which is just passed again this year, very bipartisan, will help us rethink how we think about juvenile detention centers. There are now requirements in that act, which the provisions become active October 2019, which says that every child in a juvenile detention center has to have access to high-quality educational experiences. There has to be a transitional IEP that ensures that they transition back into their school system in a very thoughtful way. There's now it's against the law for young people to be in solitary confinement in juvenile detention centers. We haven't done that in adult prisons yet. But I think there are these different kinds of opportunities that have been bipartisan in nature that we can continue to build upon, both with respect to juvenile justice reform as well as issues with adults.
Yeah, and Mayor Whaley, again, in addition to all of your work now on gun violence, you've already also been working on other issues like the opioid crisis, youth homelessness, early education, and even teen suicide. And all of these issues, I think, are wrapped up often in issues of bias and obviously some of the other topics we've discussed today. So I wonder, what are the lessons you're sort of drawing and where are the opportunities to move forward there?
Well, I think particularly on how we move forward in a bipartisan way, there are, like with the opioid epidemic, again, I see and unfortunately what happens, and the same with the justice system, is you get to a threshold where so many people have been touched by it that eventually it becomes bipartisan. And so I know that's not a very positive thought, but that's what's happening on gun violence. When you have 100 people dying every single day from either suicide or something, but always from a gun, everybody's touched by it. In the opioid epidemic, we had, I think, when the tipping point was when it was 115 people a day dying from accidental overdose in this country. Then it becomes bipartisan. And so I know that's a sad kind of downer kind of conversation, but that's what we see is then that's when you get the threshold of like, hey, something has really got to be done on this issue. But it requires, I think the other thing, and I come from the left side of the movement, of course, and I think there has to be a patience in the left because the other on these issues, the other side is very patient, and they work this nicking away. And my frustration a lot from the left side is that we just want it to be fixed right now, and we don't want to spend any time on it, and we just need to wrap this up and then it's done. Where you have to really recognize that even on common sense gun control legislation, the first step is a background check. The next step is, extreme risk protection. The next step is assault weapon ban. So you have to think of it in that way, because quite frankly, that's what the NRA has been doing on this issue for the past 2 decades. And so I could go on and on about it from the left. I'm, a self-hating liberal, and so. I get frustrated with us because we're so impatient, which is what I love about it, but also we have to have a thought process that is about the movement. And I think that's what I find in all of these issues.
Outstanding. Are there questions in the audience? I want to make sure that we get to that. Yes, go ahead, Janet.
So thank you very much. You mentioned accountability. I would just love to have 2 ideas of specifics of what you mean by accountability, or not what you mean, but strategies.
Sure. So, I think that when I was talking to Republicans, both nationally and in the State House, less in the State House, but more nationally, there is a feeling of a tipping point that has occurred, and that there is accountability at the ballot box now around these issues. And it was interesting because, again, this is, in 1994, there was accountability with the assault weapons ban, where the country was not in favor of pieces of this, and so dozens of congressmen were held accountable for that vote. I do think, again, because 100 people are dying every day from a gun, the tide has turned, and you talk to Republicans in the Senate and the House, and they know that. And there's even an argument in the 2018 elections that there was people held to account over the lack of action around common sense gun legislation post Parkland. So I think that's what I'm talking about, accountability. And mayors have, what we've said is, and some of the Republicans have said this, is we are trying to do 2 things. We're calling for action, and we're trying to be in the place of the politics of the possible. Right, so if you go to D.C., the left, the right will say, well, the left just wants this for an issue for 20, and so they're really not going to do anything. And the left will say, well, the right, doesn't want to do anything, and so they're just never going to do anything. For mayors, we are, in this space of no, we just want something done, right? We don't care who does it. We don't care who signs it. It just must get done. And so, and if it's not done, that's where we're talking about held to account. Do something. All good. And so I think that's where the decision making is right now in DC, frankly, is that politics of possibility right now in the next 6 months.
Doug, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I think you're absolutely right. I also think that as we look at other issues, particularly when it comes to that tipping point, one of them I think has to do a lot with immigration, which we haven't really talked a lot about. But I think that's another thing we have to be thinking particularly about. We know that many undocumented migrant individuals have been, there's been a lot of challenges with that, particularly when it comes to due process issues and breaking up of families, for example. So I think, as more and more of these issues tend to swell up, we have to really take hold of it and mobilize in ways that are thoughtful, but also people can see for themselves both sides of it, regardless of whether you're Republican or Democrat.
Well, and that's one that's been heartbreaking, frankly, on the other end. So, Dayton was the first city to be a welcoming community. We've prided ourselves on being immigrant-friendly. We've actually seen that growth because of bearing down on diversity and inclusion. And when we declared ourselves an immigrant-friendly community, it was in 2010. It was one of the 7 awards given by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce on being an immigrant-friendly community. And so I'm heartbroken, frankly, to see where we were in 2010 to where we are today. And that's an example of, I think, an issue going the opposite direction when there was such opportunity like there was in 2010. So that's why you have to just keep plugging away.
I want to say that as the leader of the competitive institution, Marilyn Minton, I'm with you. So I'm the president of Pratt Institute. And I want to say that the politics of the possible is something that we bring to our students. And this has been very inspiring, very moving, and a real call to action to us as leaders of young people. They are going to be all marching on Friday. They're actually our current leaders. And I think the message that you have is something that we want to share with them. But in fact, they share this with us every single day. They are at the forefront. They understand their peers. They know their family members in various institutions, whether they're higher education or they're incarcerated. They see this as actually a continuum. It's not this or that. And that's something for us to be aware of as we have a very different lens on how we look at what is going on in the world. They, of course, are not patient, but they are working very methodically. And I think that what you've done here is raise our consciousness again to bring it back to be part of their conversation. So thank you.
Thank you for that. I want to make just a comment too. Oh yeah, absolutely. So when I was last week, I was in D.C. and I went to see the Giffords folks, and it's you get into this and you're doing this, and there is a sense of just banging your head against a wall, right? And I was sharing that with them, and they said, "Oh, we have never been more optimistic." And I said, really? They said, "Oh yeah, compared to 2 years ago, like 3 years ago, we couldn't find a presidential candidate to talk about common sense gun legislation." And then they just that day had released this video of all of the Democratic nominee candidates for president saying something about it. So it's also like where you enter, right? Because if you've been so many of these groups, from Sandy Hook on, or even before Sandy Hook, that has made, they see a completely different look than I do, right? Just coming in and saying, "Gosh, this is really hard," So I think that's something to keep in mind too. So thank you.
And a lot of people, obviously, the presidential candidates have also talked about criminal justice reform, which is great too.
I have a question for you, Doug. I was taken by your comment about the prisoners coming back to the 5 communities here in New York, and then the relation to women's health.
Yes.
So what are you seeing that are actionable steps that these communities can do for both these prisoners but also for these women? What programs, what's out there, what's happening?
So I'm glad you brought that up, because in addition to immigration, gender is something we need to also focus on when it comes to mass incarceration, because we have a significant increase in the amount of women who are incarcerated now, as well as girls, and because of a lot of reasons. The other thing is we have to also understand is that a lot of these older women are caretakers, not only for their children who are incarcerated, but taking care of their children as well. So when we think about supports within communities, we have to also be aware that there's got to be a focused attention on ensuring that when people get out, before they get out, that they have a plan when they re-enter the community, and that we are very intentionally focused on employment issues, transitional housing issues, issues related to continuing education, issues related to access to health care, and this is particularly true for women, and we have to be very thoughtful about our gender responsive approaches to this. And there are a lot of different programs across the country that are specific to helping women. So for example, here in New York, College and Community Fellowship by the fabulous Vivian Nixon, which helps women who are coming out of prison to get all of those connections to employment and housing and continuing education and all the other different legal services that they need, in addition to child care. There are examples like Susan Burton in California with the New Way of Life. If you haven't read Becoming Miss Burton, look it up. She actually meets them downtown when they get off the bus. As soon as they get off the bus, when they have $50 in their pocket, she picks them all up and she takes them to her place, the housing, transitional housing, and have a whole slew of access to different kinds of services. And there are several examples across the country, not enough, but several examples across the country that are gender specific, that is focused on access to comprehensive supports around reentry that mitigate against criminogenic risk factors.
The 2.2 million people who are incarcerated in the U.S. How should we look at that number in terms of how alarmed we should be in the context of? Is it the context of how quickly that number has come up in the past 20 years? I just would love more context to that number and how we might look at it and sort of slice and dice it.
Wow. Well, there's a lot of ways to slice and dice it. But I think that we have to keep in mind that 2.2 million includes people who are also recycling back into the system. So it's important for us to, as we break it down, to think about what are the numbers of adults that are who are incarcerated, What are the numbers of women that are incarcerated and why? What are the numbers of young people who are in the juvenile justice system and in issues of confinement? Those numbers involve not only individuals who come from these communities, these imprisoned communities, as Todd Clear says, but they also represent what Jeremy Travis would call not just mass incarceration, but punitive excess. Keep in mind that you actually have people sitting in Rikers Island who've been there for 2 years because they can't pay a $500 fine. And my cousin died in a jail in Spartanburg County 3 years ago because he threw a beer can down, and in South Carolina it's a $500 fine to pollute. And so he couldn't pay the $500. He didn't have access to health care because he had a heart condition, and he died in jail. I mean, over $500. So, and those are the types of numbers that represents, the 2.2. And it's also because we're not really thinking very critically about how can we prevent that from happening in the first place. How can we make sure that people, when they're in confinement, that there's gender responsive responses to it and structures for women in particular, and that we support them to make sure that they're prepared to get out.
Okay, so we have time for one more question, so you're going to be the last.
Okay, so first of all, I want to thank you all of the Aspen Institute, everyone, for this. And Mayor Nan, you made it real for all of us because you came into our living rooms, right? Everyone in this country saw you and what you felt and what you thought, and thank you for that. This is sort of a rough kind of estimate, but maybe half of these mass shootings have been from disenfranchised young people. Yeah. And no one was really talking about that today. We talked about a lot of different things around the criminal justice system, but not getting to these kids before all of this happens. So I want to know what your thoughts are on that and how we can begin that process from kindergarten or preschool.
Right. I thought the co-director for Sandy Hook did what they're doing and the work they're doing, I think, is really important. And we connected just to make sure, for example, in Dayton that and the surrounding communities that is going on. I do think too. I mean, I think people I have a different view of the mental health conversation with guns, and so a lot of it is around the discussion of mental health and guns bad because and that's really a misnomer for us. When this happened in Dayton, one of the things we decided to do was to be really out front about the trauma that this invokes in the whole community. And even disclose look, I go see a counselor, this is tough stuff, and really encouraging people to talk, because that's my big concern is that these traumas that they go everywhere and they're mostly with young people, that they have this kind of tough guy or tough gal syndrome, that I can handle it, and that propagates a lot more of these issues of suicide, frankly, which is really, if you really get down into the gun numbers, the numbers that are really killing people around just so many guns, and so anybody can just grab one, and they kill themselves. And you're 95% effective to kill yourself if you do it with a gun. If you do it with something else, we have chances that you will be able to enter into that conversation to save your lives down the road. So I think that those conversations, it's a broader issue than just the mass shootings. It's really it's an empathy question. It's I disagree with the whole video game thing, but I do think there is an issue around social connectedness, and that's a social determinant of health that we see among young people, and how their empathy is getting further and further away from each other. I think that is affecting this, and so I think when you have the conversations that are national, they become these 10-second kind of things, and really it's about how are we really connected as a community. It's showing itself in really ugly ways when we see particularly men that hate women that end up deciding to do mass shootings. I mean, that's the kernel. They have all different sort of political views, but they all really hate women. And so there's some real discussion that I think we've only scratched the surface on. And that's going to require our police departments to trust women. Which is another big issue around, when women report things, and it falls into like the domestic violence issue. So there's just so many layers. The mass shootings are this really ugly thing we can't take our eyes off of, but there's these issues in our community and how our communities are connected that are the real function of everything, I think, on this.
Can I also say there's an amazing essay in the London Review of Books that came out last year on incels, and really talking about the challenge, what you were saying about the disconnect in terms of empathy when it comes to technology and how they've sort of isolated themselves and then manifesting their hatred for women. It's a terrible, horrible thing, and it's just something we have to be aware of and be much more intentional about.
Oh yeah, I don't think that conversation is even started, and I think that that is, for me, coming from Dayton. I mean, at the night of the vigil, a woman who has never even been reported on, there's been some reporting, came up to me like sobbing, said, I used to date him. I went to the police in 2014. I told them he was a problem, and no one would listen to me. And now I know of like 3 women now that have, done this. So what are we doing with our police departments to really take those issues seriously? How do we really understand what's going on here, particularly with men that hate women? I think that's the real deep question, frankly. Thanks for that question.
Great question.
I may borrow that.
Oh yeah, you can. I'm sorry, Warwick.
No, it's fine. Unfortunately, that's where we're going to have to leave the conversation, although, I mean, I think that we've certainly identified a lot of places where we can move forward on these issues. But I'd like to thank the 2 of you. I hope everybody will express gratitude.